best as you can remember.
Sure. In approximately October of 2008, this matter was brought to my attention. Staff came to me with this allegation of falsified information, and so we immediately discussed how we would respond to that. And number one, we wanted to assess the projects that he had worked on, as Dolores had described, and do an investigation to see what we saw in the data. Subsequent to that, in approximately January, Mr. Liebeck did provide the results of his investigation in the letter, I believe, stated January 20th, in that they've reviewed the information, reviewed the data, and found the one that it was only one structure.
Okay. When did you find out about his misappropriation of state
I did
assets?
not know about that until just recently with the results of the OIG investigation provided to the department.
Okay. Dolores, did you know about that?
Well, one clarification, the misuse of state materials was with the supervisor, not the technician.
Yeah, I think
That's what I meant to say that, yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was not aware of that until the first whistleblower letter came in, and we turned that over to Audit Investigations to look into.
Given that there are only 8 people in this department, is that the totality, including the supervisor in this branch? Was it 8 plus,
correct.
Mr.? So it's a fairly small unit. They worked in a fairly... They worked together. Obviously, they were going around the state, but I'm trying to get to how isolated, insular was this unit, I should say, and was there common knowledge of this other activity going on? And I'm trying to find out if there was a dynamic between when things stopped and properly going up the chain of command to you and then to Mr. Peplow. So did you hear anything about this extracurricular activity, or do you think it would be unusual? I mean, you're overseeing this small branch. This is purely subjective, that they would keep it to themselves. At least in terms of what the whistleblower's comment was, as I expressed it, is this sounds like within this branch they knew something was going on. One whistleblower responded, and you're their manager. So how do you find out if these things are happening? You're depending pretty much on the chain of command and the supervisor to tell you.
Absolutely. I would be depending on the office chief to elevate those issues to me.
So would someone in this process have an annual evaluation of the supervisor?
Yes. Annual evaluations are done on all employees.
And do people who are being supervised have any input in that? Do you do any kind of surveys in terms of the people who work for them, whether they're...
Not as a regular practice.
I always love it when my employees have comments about how I manage people.
It has been used in the manager level, but the engineers do not have input into their supervisors.
So in hindsight, I mean, there are obviously a lot of things. Anything you would tell us that, this is, again, all of us look at these things, we look back. Are there things that we should have done differently in your own personal belief? Are there things that you sometimes think, I wish I had done this? Not trying to play get you, but that we have used as part of corrective action to make sure it doesn't happen again?
No, I agree. There were many things I wish we could have done differently. I think when the second and third falsifications came out, there was a lot of work done to investigate the engineering analysis of those 2 structures, what was done if there was a public safety issue. We failed to document some of that analysis that was done at that time. So I think we also discovered there were a lot of record keeping that could be done better, and documentation, which is some of the procedures that was changed. Some of the procedures that the technicians have to fill out versus what the data integrity checks by the engineers that were improved later. So we learned.
Okay. So, you mentioned that Mr. Morgan could see this from his perspective, but there were other things going on, and the investigation was proceeding. Did any of you communicate that to him?
I met with Mike Morgan in May of I think it was 2010. It was much later. He had left the unit a year before to go out to a construction rotation, and he asked to meet with me. And I did meet with him, and at that point, it was very clear that he was not aware of all the investigations that were going on. He was not aware of the procedures that were changed. He was very appreciative of hearing what we had done to change those procedures. But in talking with him, it was very clear that he knew his piece of what he did.
So do you feel confident at this point, though, that the corrective actions you've taken have restored the integrity and have eliminated the problem?
I feel what was done since we found the second and third falsification, yes.
And that if for some reason you had another employee like this, how would we make sure that it would be corrected sooner?
I think the new procedures in place will be very clear. They now have timestamps. Before, we did not record timestamps, and it'd be very clear that data was modified.
Okay. Senator Huff, do you have any questions of Mr. Anzioni? I think Mr. Davis, I actually don't have any questions for you, but if you want to jump in here and suggest questions for me to ask, I'm more than happy to. This goes back to the Bay Bridge, and I appreciate the level that you've talked about how separated this incident was, but obviously, I'm being redundant in terms of the importance of this bridge. You're aware of that, obviously. So when did you learn of the possibility of inaccurate tests when it comes to the Bay Bridge project?
I wouldn't say that I learned about the possibility of inaccurate tests because, again, it's my understanding that there are no fabricated tests for the Bay Bridge. But I did first learn about this issue, I'd say it was about a little over a month ago.
Okay. And when did you notify Mr. Heminger of that and your colleagues on the Oversight Committee?
I notified Mr. Heminger.
Okay. When was the communication between you two? When did you do that? Was that prior to Mr. Heminger and Mr. Dougherty? You decided to communicate to Mr. Heminger? Just trying to follow the timeline and either one of you?
Yeah,
I'm just trying to establish the process of how the Oversight Committee found out about this.
I spoke to Tony, and then I spoke to Steve Heminger, as well as Bill Reinhardt, who's the other member of the Toll Bridge Program Oversight Committee.
And consistent with Mr. Heminger's testimony, that was about 10 days before the Sacramento Bee came out?
That's correct.
But you knew about these things prior to that?
I knew about falsifications on 3 other structures, and that there was no falsification on the Bay Bridge.
But you knew that the individual had done work on the Bay Bridge?
Yes.
And you didn't feel, either of you, the need to tell Mr. Heminger that, or did you miss it?
In Tony's defense, he didn't know back in 2009. I didn't either. I'm in a new role. But the department at that time did not tell the other members of the TB-POC because there was no issue to identify. There was no problem at identifying. So if an information item was passed on at the TB-POC, it would have been that there's no problem.
But it wouldn't have been, it seems to me it would have been wise, and if I was in Mr. Heminger's shoes, you would like to know that there was a problem as soon as possible and that this individual, you would want to be reassured, just as you said. So it seems to me that if what you're saying is true, you would have wanted to tell the Oversight Committee as soon as possible that there was an individual, there was a problem, but you've isolated it and he didn't have anything to do with the Bay Bridge, rather than tell him 10 days before the newspaper was going to report it. Is that an unfair statement?
I would agree with that.
So why didn't we do it sooner?
I can't vouch for my predecessors.
So is it your predecessors as the director? I'm not trying to coy him, Mr. Dougherty. I'm trying to find out who it is I should be asking.
I was not a member of the TB-POC back then.
What were you doing?
At this time, I was a district director in District 6.
District 6, which is where?
Fresno.
Fresno. Happy place, probably. All right. Well, that's good information because we'll pursue that, obviously, that there was a failure, and obviously Mr. Heminger, I assume, is going to pursue that in his conversations as well. Okay. Any questions of any of these folks from?
Yeah, quick question. Ms. Valls made a comment about you do some timestamps now that you didn't do before. Is that on the raw data?
There were several different investigations. The first investigation, when Jason found the first falsifications, it was on a date stamp. They were the stamp of the raw data was changed, events, such as the next day is how he found it. That's how those investigations were done. Later, the investigation was expanded to date and time, and now our process is to record the date and time on the field sheets.
So that's the raw data that you're doing, the date and time it was assessed? Because
When
we
they're
heard
there-
before that they're already doing it, when you take that and you process it, and I don't remember the initials or whatever that you're doing it to, but there was a date and time on that, and that was how you could kind of cross-check.
I might be able to answer that better.
Okay, please.
If I may. When the process that has changed is when the technician goes out in the field, they have a daily log. They hand write in each hole when they begin each hole, and then they push the button to log in, run the probe down, and come back. And that piece of information, both the RD file and the LAS file, are date stamped, date and time stamped. Okay. So part of the procedure now is we bring that information back to the testing engineer. The testing engineer has a check sheet that evaluates both the written hard copy as well as electronic to make sure that they're the same, that we don't have that potential problem anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Gaines?
If this has been answered, I apologize, but I just want clarification in my mind in terms of reviewing all data that was on projects that Mr. Wiles and Leibach were engaged in. Has that already been done, or? Okay.
I don't know if you want to explain. Yeah, all his work has been reviewed by our technicians back to a certain point in his career, and then the FHWA stuff went back to 2004.
Okay, and okay, so FHWA looked at specifically Mr. Wiles' work?
We gave FHWA every gamma test that we had tested back to 2004, including Mr. Wiles' work.
Okay.
And
all
that
right.
would have included all the technicians' collection of those tests, including on the Bay Bridge.
Okay, so it was just those three examples that were cited earlier that we had big problems with.
That we had any concern with, there was
Okay.
3 locations.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Peploe, how long were you the division chief for engineering services? Trying to find out who was in what place at what time.
I began that role in, I believe, June of 2007.
Okay. And then you left?
Just recently in May of this year to take the acting chief engineer position.
Which is a step up in the organizational chart, or?
Yes.
Okay. And how many employees did you have when you were the engineering services chief?
Approximately 1,900.
1,900. Okay. And given again that you have 2,000 employees, you had a lot of responsibility. How would you be sure that the process was being followed? I mean, it seems like the systemic problem is you had a problem in a small branch, but a very important branch. You had a supervisor who appears to be relaying information to you. You had a relationship between him and one of his employees. So how would you find out about this? Ultimately, you're responsible for the HR process of the 2,000 people who worked for you.
With regard to the products and services that come out of engineering services, we're working and have been for some time now on developing better quality assurance, independent quality assurance processes and procedures. When I talk about IQA, I'm talking about a separate arm of engineering services coming in and reviewing the work of various units within the division. So I think that is something we need to work on and continue to evolve to make sure that as work comes out and we have various products and services such as gamma logging or design of bridges or materials engineering reports, those types of things, that we have a process in place that is methodical and routine.
And you feel like now you've improved upon that as opposed to when all this happened?
I believe we've improved upon that, but I think it's still a work in progress.
So given that you were in this position during this time frame, in terms of the communication, when did you know about the problem with Mr. Leibich in the branch? When did you first know about it?
Well, through the whistleblower letter was something
So that's the first you heard about it?
Yeah, I mean, I had heard occasional, we have issues within the branch, but nothing to the extent of the things that we've seen here. With
So you had heard something prior to the whistleblower?
Yes.
And did you do anything about that, or did you just think these were common sort of? I know you had a lot of employees.
It occurs occasionally. I don't believe I did anything specific with that information at the time.
So if you had a problem with a supervisor, or you thought there was a problem, or they weren't communicating with you freely, would you do something about it? I mean, obviously, you'd take some action.
Yes, definitely.
So did you have your relationship with Mr. Leibich? Did you talk to him about this at all, or would that go down the chain of command?
No, I would have been his third line supervisor, so would rely on my subordinate managers to, through the annual performance and appraisal process of the employees' performance, to remedy any issues we had with a specific employee.
And given the work that the engineering division was doing and its relationship with the Bay Bridge, were you aware of the oversight committee?
Yes, I was.
So you were in this position when this information started to become, you knew the position. So I guess in terms of who was where, when, and previous director, did you have any concerns that this hadn't been communicated to the oversight committee? That a person within the branch you knew that had falsified 3 instances, and that he had done work on the Bay Bridge. So you were aware of all that at the time. Did you have any concern, or did you take any action to try to notify the oversight committee?
I did not. I notified my supervisor, but at that particular time, when we were going through that process from late 2008 to the middle of 2009, I did not know which employees worked on which projects.
Okay. All right. I appreciate it. Anything else, Senator Gaines?
Are we getting ready to wrap up?
We are getting ready to wrap up.
Could I just bring up a couple of issues which...
Certainly. Well, why don't we finish with the witnesses, and then we're going to take public comment, and then I would like to have a little discussion with both of you about suggestions for next steps. Mr. Dougherty, you have any concluding comments? I want to thank you all for being here today. I came into this hearing sort of very open-minded, and as I said, we don't want a witch hunt, but there's another expression, we don't want to whitewash either. These are extremely serious problems. I think you all agree. Anybody who had any pride in their career choice or pride in the people they work with, I'm sure would be concerned with it. I assume that you would be more concerned with it, given in a certain way when you first heard about it, because this is your career choice. You know that, I assume, there's a good esprit de corps in the vast majority of employees, and eliminating a bad employee or a couple is the first and foremost thing. So I entered this hearing with that sort of framework, but we're not done, obviously, and we have lots of other audits and investigations going on. One of the things that still concerns me the most is, and maybe it's because I'm a politician and I have to deal with the press and the public all the time, and I've had to for a long time, but when public documents are public documents, the best thing to do is to give them to the press as soon as possible. And we have our own issues, I know, about public documents in the legislature, and I'm mindful of that. But for me personally, it's just easier to be forthright. Now, I know that people will take advantage of that. That's the nature of democracy, but it's a concern I've had up until, and I still have, by the way. I mean, it's been very helpful that you gave us the information. As I mentioned, I know Mr. Oberstar had a busy weekend, but, you know, and getting all this information was good, but on the other hand, have we gotten everything? And to some degree, you get to a point where the expression data dump happens to us, where it's like, okay, you get it dumped on. And I'm not suggesting that was done. If we're going to work on this together and we're the same mind, it's not a gotcha game. It's to make sure that it's corrected and we rebuild the confidence in the general public. So I do appreciate you being here, and as of this moment, I'm inclined to think that we'll work with the Assembly Transportation Committee, but I think this committee will want to have a follow-up hearing, and I'd certainly like to hear from those other, Mr. Morgan in particular, if he's available. But that's sort of where I am. Mr. Darger, do you have any concluding comments?
I appreciate the opportunity to answer as many questions as we possibly could. I hope that we've tried to express the level of confidence to you that we have, that there's no issues on the Bay Bridge, as well as that we've narrowed this down to one technician and 3 other structures. We've gone back and confirmed that those structures are safe to the motoring public. That's our primary mission as a Department of Transportation. And I'd look forward to answering any questions that you have in the future. The binder that we provided you was as much information as we thought we could provide you to try to answer the questions about the issue that we were dealing with. I wouldn't capture this as everything that we have. I've already articulated that there's a lot of other information regarding the Bay Bridge, and I would love to work with you and provide you with any information that you'd like to have, and also answer any questions as we move forward.
Well, we're going to have, as a consequence of this meeting, there's multiple questions, including some of the ones we had earlier, as to who knew what when and when did they communicate that to people. So we can clearly, this is very complicated, and we're going to have to spend a little more time on it. Senator Huff had another question, and then we will let you excuse ourselves and go to public comment, and then maybe we can conclude with the direction.
It's more comment because I'm going to have to leave here in about 5 minutes or so. But I appreciate you coming and answering the questions. I'm glad we didn't have to look at 40 gigabytes of binary code. That wouldn't help a whole lot. And I think that's part of what needs to happen, is to put this in a way that the layperson can understand and feel some confidence that the product we're getting with our taxpayer money is safe. Because that's obviously the question that's raised. I'm a little bit troubled about what seems to be a systemic problem in the agency, and perhaps this is a good time just to make sure we have the systems in place to try to keep the human factor at bay, because we are humans. We do make mistakes, sometimes by design, sometimes by default, but having proper systems in place helps keep that from playing out in unwanted manners. I'm concerned that it took a whistleblower in the press to really bring this to light, I'm concerned that even when your agency knew about it, they didn't let the Oversight Committee know that there was a technician out there that had a history or some, investigation going on about that, and yet he was tasked with working on sensitive pilings of the bridge. I'm concerned that the LAO has previously said that Caltrans is overstaffed by about 1,500 people that could save $200 million if we eliminated those positions. I'm concerned the Bureau of State Audits has said the department is incapable of managing its personnel. And it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is like a little blister on that, of exposing that maybe that's true. Maybe we don't have the systems in place to manage that. And it's playing out in a way. The state auditor actually made some predictions that there would be some problems were that not brought into line. On the flip side is we see Caltrans tasked with very important and sensitive things, and yet most of the new construction is happening with the self-help counties. They make a case to the people, they get the money to do it. In some cases they contract out, in some cases they don't, but maybe because they're smaller, maybe because they do contract out, they seem to get things done a little bit better. Maybe that's just a perception. But when you do contract out things in a public-private partnership, the risk is transferred to the private sector. I can only imagine if you sitting here before us were a private entity that had falsified information, what the consequences would be. First of all, you'd be out of business. Second of all, you would have to make up, the fixes. If there was data that went back and you had to cross-check your binary data with whatever else, that would be eaten by the business, not by the taxpayers. And yet we have a system where we sole source it and we pay for the consequences because we're not outsourcing our liability problems as we do when we contract out. So as Vice Chair of Budget, I just want to say we're heading into another time. We're possibly pulling trigger on things. I think the governor has done some realignment. There's pros and cons for that. This is an area he may want to look at realigning some of the projects to the counties that are already doing a good job in that. And so I think to the degree that a lot of these things are on the table as we try to make our state budget and our programs work, it's a good time for you to, it's not Fresno, come up here and try to make it work better, because we're looking at everything. And we we have had confidence in the structures we drive across. We want to continue to have that, and we will have more questions as we go on. But I do thank you for coming here and helping us understand a little better the situation we're faced with. Thanks.
Senator Gaines, and this can go as concluding comments too. We are going to hear from the public, and we will listen to all your comments as well and respond to them.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to wrap up with things that were stated earlier, but just clarification, because the question I ask is, we've had the hearing, where do we go from here? And I would recommend that the Bureau of State Audits does an investigation, be number one. Number two, that we take a look at the LAO recommendations in terms of their systematic reform and the use of best practices. Again, I think this is a great opportunity for the governor to look at creating a new paradigm for how we provide government services here in the state of California. And then finally, I think we still need to clarify the safety issue as far as the Bay Bridge is concerned. And you talked about another independent analysis by a third party. I'd like to continue to have that conversation as we move forward. I'm sure we'll be communicating in the months ahead on what's happening with the Bay Bridge. So those would be the three areas that I would recommend that we move forward on, and would love to have that discussion with our chairman and members of the committee. Thank you.
Well, I'm certainly, both comments, although we have some differences about how fat the organization is and how many cuts we need to be, I'm certainly the sympathies. I think we all share that we're going to have more tough decisions, obviously, very soon. And I'd like to do, and as much as we've answered a lot of questions here, as I reflect on this and as we go through the testimony, I think we've brought up a lot of questions, particularly the two that stick with me. And, systemic structures, and whether form follows function or function follows form, are really good, and I think engineers are particularly good with that type of analytical approach. However, that's only as good as the people within the organizations, and the fact that you had two people, and I'm sure you share this, were doing this kind of work, and then there are other people within the branch who seemed, at least, and I go back to that one paragraph, who are aware of it and we're accepting it. Well, not accepting it, but it was generally held knowledge, is a huge concern to me, because you can set up all the systems in the world, but if a supervisor wants to, or maybe Mr. Wiles was using information because he knew that his supervisor was vulnerable vis-a-vis his use of public property and public employees, maybe there was a dynamic there. But whatever it was something that I'm still not sure we've corrected, to be perfectly honest, and I think I'm going to look forward to the Assembly Transportation hearing, and we'll certainly try to sit in if I'm invited or watch. But I think this most likely will take a second hearing of this committee, either in conjunction with the Assembly, hopefully, to do follow-up. And as I said, I would love to hear from Mr. Morgan and others, because that's the biggest problem, is there are a lot of human mistakes here, including not telling the Oversight Committee, which we specifically set up in this instance to make sure that the Bay Bridge, as Senator Gaines has mentioned over and over again, we need to make sure that it was isolated, as you said, but certainly the cultural things bring up many concerns. So we do, and I do want to go back to my opening comments, want to coordinate and be thoughtful about how we do our own investigation. So we've got the Bureau of State Audits doing an investigation now, and Senator Gaines, you and I can talk about whether we would like to either jointly, or you would like to do something with the Joint Legislative Audit Committee to expand it. We heard today that there's a third-party review that the department's doing, so that's in addition to the U.S. Department of Transportation, the internal audit, and the state audit, and then we've got the Mr. Hemminger's group that's clearly going to do an open public report, and then we've got the LAO reports and the Bureau of Audit reports that have to do with larger things that have already been mentioned. So I want to thank you again for being here. I want to thank you for being forthright and giving us the information we asked for. I know it was difficult logistically. It may have seemed like we were being mean and abusive. That's just a term of art. That's not a technical term. but that's the nature of our business. So we have to proceed with this. We thank you for answering a lot of our questions, and to the degree that you have comments or questions, we'd particularly like to continue to work with you on a timeline and dealing with all the issues that have come up today. So thank you again. Mr. Daugherty, thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming. With that, last part of our agenda is public comment. If there's any member of the public who would like to address the committee, now is the time. Please just come right up forward and join us.
Good afternoon, Mr.
Welcome.
Chairman, Senators. My name is Sam Hassoun, and I'm here representing the Associated General Contractors of California. AGC has a membership of over 1,000 contractors that work on heavy civil and heavy construction highway projects up and down the state. Many of them work on Caltrans projects. Although many of them do complain about the intensity of the specifications and the qualifications that Caltrans imposes on them, mainly on the Bay Bridge and the toll bridge. They do hold Caltrans with high integrity, especially the toll program, the Bay Bridge in particular. It's very intense, it's very demanding. The quality control and quality assurance specifications is high and intense, and the contractors often complain. Yet, they still view this department, Caltrans, and in particular the toll program, as a premier organization. And they do view them as an owner of choice. Oftentimes, they would like to compare them constantly with other states, and they hold Caltrans as the benchmark for the best and the premier engineering organization. It is unfortunate what we're going through today through the hearings. I do hope, on behalf of the AGC, that this is an anomaly, and the fact that we are going through this hearing, at least it is a testament that Caltrans, the industry as a whole, are willing to dig deep to find where those imperfections are, especially in organizations as large as Caltrans. But we need to definitely move on and still take pride in the Bay Bridge and what's going on currently. It is a signature bridge. It is a monument that many people around the world are looking at. And trust me, even our competitors in other nations are taking a close look at what we're doing. We do have faith in the industry about the leadership of Caltrans, Mr. Daugherty and his predecessor, Mr. Kempton, and all their executive team, especially on the toll bridge and the Bay Bridge. So with that, I do hope that when this is all over, we can still hold our heads high and still take pride of Caltrans and the work they do. Us, our families, yourselves, we would like to cross that bridge safely and feel comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Anyone else who would like to speak under public comment? If not, thank you again for all being with us. Thank you for your indulgence, and we are adjourned.